You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lolana, a literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know and understand these works.
And if you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week?
This week, we got the film episode.
The film.
We got a real good one, as long as you're not the director, who did not think so. This week, we're going to be covering Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 film Solaris, which he once referred to as his least successful of his films. We're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about wives becoming mothers. We're going to talk about German mysticism. We got a pretty packed episode here.
I know, just like Solaris is a pretty packed movie, and so that's the Slavic Literature Pod guarantee that when you're covering great directors, we're going directly for the ones they hated.
We're going for, that's just low-hanging fruit for us.
I know, low-hanging fruit of a 2 hour and 40-something minute movie.
It's, I promise, it feels longer than it is. I love this film, but it feels longer than it is. I will, before we get into it itself, I want to say it's very, I forget where I read this, but it's very trance-like, sitting down and watching it. You do fall into it feels simultaneously shorter and longer than its watch time because it really does draw you in, but also you're very aware of, oh my God, how long have I been here? How long has this scene been going on for? 5 minutes? Good God. Yeah, it's also one of those where you'll feel dumber watching it, but your friends will think you're smarter for having watched it.
Right.
So you kind of have that going for you.
Yeah. So let's talk about why are we covering Solaris. People might be wondering if it's his least favorite film. Why are we talking about this?
Well, honestly, I just wanted to talk about it because I like it.
That's fair.
What about you? Why do you want to cover Solaris?
Well, Solaris, it's like often as we talk about it is a almost genre-defining film in the same category as Kubrick's Space Odyssey 2001. They're often talked about in the same breath, but as we'll cover in this episode, that's not really a good comparison, right? 2001 comes out, I think, in 1969. This is 72. They're very closely tied together, but superficially they could be read as the same, but they are absolutely not similar, really, in content, even in the slightest. And if you've not watched it before, it is worth watching it, but I think it's just worth talking about to kind of clarify this film, which Tarkovsky himself seems to have hated that it was sci-fi or is included in the sci-fi genre.
Yeah, I think that's fun. I didn't really want to get into why cover a Tarkovsky film because if you don't really know anything about Tarkovsky, I feel like this probably won't be the episode for you. Mm-hmm. For me, it's kind of like a self-evident one.
Sure.
Essentially, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time.
Yeah.
And thankfully, he falls into our canon, so we can talk about him on the show, which is great.
That's fair.
And I feel like every episode where I'm like, oh, that's really interesting if you think about it, that's the exact same shot that Tarkovsky uses in whatever film. I can finally talk about those shots now.
Right. There we go.
It's about time.
And in future
My time has come.
Right. And in future episodes, when you have to make that comparison, you can say, instead of me making this point again, just go back to this episode. So by listening, you're already prepared for that. So good work.
Well, I literally did this when we covered Leviathan, and I was like, this is the exact same shot from Solaris. And I said I would post screen grabs on Twitter, and then I didn't. So, oops.
So this is the makeup for that.
Just watch Solaris now. You'll get it.
Right. Just carve out 3 hours of your day and watch Solaris.
Yeah. Easy.
Anything we want to talk about? I mean, Tarkovsky is Tarkovsky, but anything you want to zoom in on before we kind of talk about Solaris itself for Tarkovsky?
If you're interested in his kind of chronology, this, like you said, comes out in 72. So he's done Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev right before this. And he does Mirror and Stalker after this. That's the end of his Soviet films before he does Nostalgia and Sacrifice. And so this is sort of the middle road Tarkovsky, I guess. It's interesting that this is not his favorite film, even though it's after some sort of progression of, his own filmmaking.
I think there's still plenty here to talk about. It might not be his own favorite, but it definitely is a student favorite from the courses that I've TA'd for on Tarkovsky. This is one that they like a lot. This and Mirror, for whatever reason, Mirror students lap that one up. It's infinitely more confusing than Solaris, but it's still good.
Right, yeah. Cool. So, anything else you want to cover about Solaris before we talk about what happens in the movie itself?
I wanted to talk about how Tarkovsky did not like Kubrick, and I think that that's really funny, that the only reason that these two films are linked was because it was marketed as like the Soviet Space Odyssey, and I don't think Tarkovsky took too kindly to that.
No. I don't know his exact reaction, but based on everything else he feels about sci-fi as a genre and Solaris's inclusion in it, I can see him not taking it well.
So Kubrick really admired Tarkovsky, like a lot. And in return, Tarkovsky said that Kubrick was cold and sterile. So, his films were, not him personally.
Right.
Although he might be, I don't know. So that's kind of the response that you get to that. So I think that this is a really interesting film for us as from the West. We have a really developed sort of idea of what sci-fi is and what it looks like. And Tarkovsky just kind of puts this out and he's like, sci-fi? And so I think it'll be interesting to talk about as we go through whether sci-fi is like a helpful framework or if it's kind of a hindrance on its way to something more.
Yeah. Tarkovsky definitely didn't think it was helpful, but I think I'm willing to disagree with him a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit on that specific front.
Yeah, I mean, to each their own.
To each their own, right?
I still like the film quite a lot.
Yeah, me too. But speaking of to each their own, person or guest, as you will, let's talk about what happens in Solaris itself. So this is a long film, so we're going to cut down very briefly, but in short, we start on this kind of countryside estate, and we've got this guy who's dressed great, blue leather jacket. I forget the color of his pants, but walking through this estate, lots of natural. Stunning, yes. Walking through this estate, and then he goes to meet inside. This is Chris Kelvin. He goes inside to meet with this cosmonaut Burton, and we get a little bit more background in that Burton is one of these cosmonauts from this. I think it's so Solaris is this planet that has been discovered at some point, and there's this ocean, which the initial pilots who went in and to see what's going on, kind of come back kind of traumatized. I think one doesn't even come out at all. And so this leads to this massive scientific inquiry into what's going on here. And for the most part, the bureaucracy doesn't seem to believe that something's actually going on there, but they believe that people who go there freak out. And so Burton, who was one of these original cosmonauts, shows Chris Kelvin, who is going to go to the space station over Solaris soon, this tape to kind of tell him, basically, here's what you should expect, in sort of a way to beg him to take him seriously, because not a lot of people do. And what the tape is a recording of what he saw when he flew over the ocean. And his recounting is that he saw a giant, like the son of the other pilot, but gigantic, the pilot who died. And the film itself shows nothing. It just shows ocean, which is, in this flashback, everyone else sees too. So they don't take Burton too seriously. And also Kelvin doesn't take him too seriously, and that leads to the two of them talking more and getting into an argument, and Burton, taking off, basically being like, I don't even know why I came here. And then we follow Burton through, no joke, 5 minutes of watching him in a taxi. That's how this film goes.
It's good.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love that scene. It's a good moment for reflection.
It was the longest continuous shot ever put into a film, I think, in world cinema at that time.
That's interesting. I'd believe it.
Yeah, you would believe it, having seen it, right? I'd wager some money on that one.
So from there, we follow Chris as he goes to the station, and as he gets in, there are supposed to be 3 people there: Gavarian, Sartorius, and Snout. And he gets in, and he notices this place is it's a space station, very 1970s space station. I feel like that should convey what I mean, but lots of flashing buttons, dials everywhere. It's very sterile in comparison to the family home we've just come from. And he and our friend Kelvin can't find anybody. I'm sorry, I keep tripping over. I don't know when this happened. At some point in my notes, I made if you type K period, it replaces that with Khrushchev and on auto caps. and I kept doing K period as shorthand for Kelvin, but so now I just have Khrushchev in caps all throughout my notes.
Yeah, well, he does come to the space station at some point. Right?
Right? He comes and his guest is just corn. It's kind of weird. But so Kelvin can't find anybody, and eventually he kind of hears this music and goes and he finds Snout, one of the guys who's been in the station for a number of years, and Snout does not look okay. He's kind of having this conversation, and he's like, "Hey, buddy, everything all right?" And Snout turns around and says, "Hey, who are you?" And he says, "Oh, I'm Chris Kelvin. I'm here. I'm the psychologist. I'm here to kind of check out the station. Where is the lead? Where is Gabarian?" And Snout says, "Oh, well, Gabarian killed himself." And Kelvin's like, "Oh," and Snout's like, "Yeah, look, hey, you're probably going to go through a lot. Take some time, go to your quarters, get settled in. Also, hey, just a heads up, if you see anything, it's real." And you kind of really want to explain what he means by that too much. He's telling him to act as if all is normal. And from there, we kind of go on into more of sort of the mystery of the film, where as he finds tapes in Gabarian's rooms, or Kelvin, is speaking to Sartorius, we find out that this sea, Solaris, creates what they call guests, or basically these apparitions of a sort, which are pulled directly from the psyches of each of the men, and whatever Gabarian saw, is what drove him to suicide. And the film continues, and what happens is Hari, who is Kelvin's wife who died or killed herself over 10 years ago at this point in the film, comes back suddenly, and Kelvin doesn't react too well the first time. He blows that first apparition into space in a rocket after tricking her into it, but Hari reappears, and this time...
My question was that his escape pod? Like, did he have one?
At the end of the film, they seem to think going back to Earth is an option, so maybe they just have auto-loaded, right. I don't know, ICBMs in there.
It just seems like the escape pods or rockets back would be a scarce resource.
Right. I don't think Tarkovsky gave too much of a shit about the logistics of this station.
No, he didn't, but they endlessly interest me.
But, a different director probably would have made that a little bit more important than just a side note.
I think it's awesome that you get a sci-fi film where he's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't care. I think it's great.
It truly is.
My students, they can't wrap their minds around that. Because we love to, sit around and talk about world building.
Right.
And Tarkovsky was like, I don't know, we're going to go float around the library for 5 minutes.
And everyone else is so concerned with this idea of genre. And I think this is the same interview where he calls Solaris the least, successful of films. He's also like, I only think there's one genre, film itself. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah, a bit of a purist, wasn't he?
Right. So Hari comes back, and this time, and also of note, Hari has no recollection of anything of her own life. She only knows herself really in relation to Kelvin, but she's also physically a perfect recreation of the original Hari, down to the original Hari killed herself with an injection. And this apparition, this guest, also has that needle mark, but she has no recollection of killing herself. She has no recollection of her life outside of Kelvin, because as the other characters explain, these guests are not true individuals as we would understand them as humans. Rather, they are pulled from your mind. So this Hari is one that only exists in relation to Kelvin, because this Hari is literally created from his perspective on her. And over the next, I think it's an hour of the film, this is sort of a process of humanization that goes from, initially, Kelvin blasting this guest off into space, and the second time around, this new Hari, him kind of falling in love, or because after his wife's death, he realizes that he loved her. It's part of the reason why she wasn't doing too great beforehand. He admits he grows to love this new Hari as his own original wife, even though the film repeatedly demonstrates she's clearly not human. She's got no concept of pain. When he tries to lock her in a room, she just bursts right through, completely bloody. He's like, "Hey, what's up? Where are we going?" And at another point,
my dog. Anytime I leave the room.
Another point, after Kelvin accepts her as a real person of a sort, Sartorius is like, "Look, she's not even take a blood sample. She's not even a carbon-based life form. This is not your wife." But he's like, she is, and he really begins to treat her as a person. And at the same time, this Hari, who initially comes into existence only as a reflection of Kelvin's interpretation of her, or his understanding of her, slowly begins to build an understanding of herself, and an understanding of herself which stands outside of the original Hari, as she, as I believe Sartorius tells her that the original Hari committed suicide, and she understands that she's something else. She starts to engage more, ask Kelvin more questions about it. I don't entirely understand. She at some point watches a film of his childhood. I don't entirely understand if that's literally a film or if that's her accessing some sort of memory. Obviously, she's created from his memories, and the abilities of Solaris are not ever elaborated on beyond the ability to reach into their minds. But she develops her own sense of personhood, and again tries to kill herself, but this time is brought back by Kelvin. And after a very strange scene in which Kelvin has this very sweaty sleep, and he has this dream of having a life back on Earth with Hari. Of course, this time Hari is played, well, not of course, she's played by a different actress, and which is only remarked on by Kelvin saying, "That's weird, I don't entirely remember your face." In this very, also I should note, very yellow scene. Not very yellow, literally like everything is colored yellow. And he goes through this whole sequence for a while before waking up and finding that a note from Hari basically explaining that there's this laser, what they call an annihilator, that I believe Snout was working on to basically destroy this ability of Solaris to reach into their minds. And he was never able to make it work. But Hari, with her abilities, with not being entirely human, is able to finish it at the cost of her own life. And suddenly, when they all wake up and the station is a wreck, and they note that the sea is no longer reaching to their minds, everything seems normal, and they sit back, kind of chat about what are we going to do next. Let's go back to Earth. And then the next scene, we see Chris coming back home to his father and mother's house. Well, his father's inside, and interestingly, being poured on him from above, which he does not seem to understand. And when his father sees him, his father walks outside, and Chris, still standing on the porch, falls to his knees and grabs his father's waist, which will be important. Grabs his father's waist and kind of hugs him, and then the camera pulls back and keeps pulling back up into the sky, and keeps pulling back and keeps pulling back until you begins to see that this entire world is its vision imprinted on the surface of the sea of Solaris itself. And that's where the boom reveal, inception noise. That's where the film ends.
Yeah, this film seems to take a lot from Inception, actually.
Right. I think that actually you could say Inception is really where this whole thing started.
Yeah, you don't have Tarkovsky without Christopher Nolan.
Right. So necessarily by that explanation, we had to leave a lot out, but that's because we think it's worthwhile more to talk about specifics than to relitigate every individual moment of this film, because this is, again, 2 hours and 40 minutes long. There's a lot of content here.
And just go watch it. I mean, most of you have probably already seen it if you're here.
Right. Or if you haven't, you should take some time out. You're good on you. So you should watch it.
Okay, I think this is a good time for a break. We'll be back in just a second.
This episode is brought to you, as always, by our listeners. You can support independent podcasting by heading to our website, slaviclitpod.com. You'll get access to the notes we used to make this episode, including links to all of the secondary sources mentioned. Sorry, I hit my mic with my pen. I was gesturing too wildly.
If you want to support the show, but you don't want to spend any of your hard-earned space money, you can join our email list for free at slaviclitpod.com, or leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts.
Questions, comments, want to appear on our Office Hours podcasts? Drop us a line. You can reach our voicemail at 209-800-3944. Or you can also email us a voice recording or text question at slaviclitpod@gmail.com. We'll bring your question onto the podcast and do our best to address it.
All right, back to our Japanese taxi.
Matt, do you mind if we start? I know there's a lot to talk about here, but Tarkovsky happened to very helpfully write a book about his work called Sculpting in Time. Do you want to talk about some of the things he goes over in his book there about Solaris before we start going into our own materials?
I just want to briefly mention Sculpting in Time generally.
Sure, yeah.
Because I listened to a few podcasts on Solaris, or maybe only like one, because there really isn't a lot on Solaris.
Right.
And the one that I had listened to, they didn't really mention this. I was looking for sort of a more kind of analytical something when I was kind of first watching it, and I was going through it, and I was hoping to find something that was kind of helpful. And you would be amazed to find anybody who knew that Tarkovsky wrote a book called Sculpting in Time, where he writes about his film theory, because most people don't seem to know that he did that. And so if you're interested in Tarkovsky and you have not read Sculpting in Time, you need to read Sculpting in Time. It's a wonderful, wonderful addition to all of his films. Kind of with the exception of Solaris, because he really glosses over that one.
Literally a couple paragraphs talking about the acting and 2 paragraphs about the movie itself.
Yeah, you get some cool photos, though. It's still good, though, for just his kind of approach to film and how it sets him apart from other directors. And also just like, yeah, you have to be like a certain kind of guy to write your own book on your own film theory.
Right. I guess if you're Tarkovsky, you get that right.
Yeah. No, that'll kind of tell you where our starting point is, I think.
Yeah. So I think that book itself, well, actually, something before we even get into talking what he says about Solaris itself, I think an interesting point that when I was reading a couple first chapters of that book was that he speaks about cinema specifically in the era, I think this is written in the 80s at some point. He talks about cinema as like an art that has gone through a death and rebirth, and that audiences have come to expect so much more now that we can no longer go back to the early days of like Soviet filmmaking, where we could have relatively simple works and people would be amazed. And you could, as like many of these early filmmakers did, wanted to convey a message, or at least we're kind of told, hey, you need to convey an educational component, not educational like learning, but kind of like class educational. And then he argues in this that cinema, it's no longer possible to have that single takeaway for all people. Rather, what must happen and what the audience and director desires to happen is a dialogue to happen between the two. And that is what must necessarily take place in filmmaking. So I thought that was an interesting thing, and kind of going forward and thinking about how I watched Solaris in this case. Do you mind if I read the 2 paragraphs he writes about Solaris? Just so you know where he stands in the film.
Sure, go ahead.
All right, sounds good. Solaris had been about people, lost in the cosmos, and obliged, whether they liked it or not, to take one more step up the ladder of knowledge. Man's unending quest for knowledge, given to him gratuitously, is a source of great tension, for it brings with it constant anxiety, hardship, grief, and disappointment. The characters were dogged by disappointment, and the way out we offered them was illusory enough. It lay in dream, in the opportunity to recognize their own roots, which forever link man to the earth, which bore him. But even those links had already become unreal for him. And that's really all he has to say about the film, beyond talking about the actors in it. So, as a baseline, we can understand Tarkovsky getting at here that it does not care about the sci-fi element. This is about people's own quest in relation to themselves, which you might have gotten a little bit from the summary of all these fantastical elements. These space stations mean nothing in the face of an alien presence coming to find its own sort of sentience in a way, its own understanding of itself.
Right.
And lives dogged by disappointments. But anyway, I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about more at that book specifically before we go more generally.
I wanted to just kind of broach the Eisenstein debate, chronology, if you will. Because essentially in Soviet cinema, pretty much, because Eisenstein was pretty much the first to ever do it, and one of the best to ever do it. So a lot of directors are either reacting to, purposefully imitating, or reacting against, trying something different than Eisenstein was doing. And Eisenstein's most noted for his theories of montage that he develops. And there's other people like Kuleshov that are working around the same time in the 1920s as him. But what Tarkovsky is specifically saying here is he's kind of reacting against Eisenstein's idea of intellectual montage specifically, and Eisenstein's kind of grand project to build a universal film language, which is a lot of what my own dissertation work is on, because stuff kind of rips. It's really interesting to me.
Is that line? Did you write that in your thesis?
Yeah, it's my subtitle. This stuff rips.
Montage in Soviet film. Let it rip.
Let it rip, baby. Yeah. So he has a completely different take, which is that the film almost has sort of a life or a rhythm of its own, and the director sort of kind of, I don't know how you describe it. He sort of helps it along, but that sort of internal rhythm is already part of it. Cinema is a sort of pure art, he says, right? it's its own thing. For Eisenstein, cinema was not a pure art; it was an umbrella art. So other arts are supposed to kind of be folded into cinema, and the director takes this very firm hand in the editing in order to deliver, like you said, this ideological, this class-based message. And the goal with intellectual montage is to kind of is to create a third meaning, which is separate from the, I feel like maybe I should explain intellectual montage if I'm going to use it. So in Eisenstein's film Strike, at the very end of the film, there's these shots that are intercut of these protesters being brutally murdered by the Tsarist police and a cow being slaughtered at a butcher. They happen at two different chronological periods. They're completely unrelated. When these two are spliced together, it creates a third meaning. And this is, right, the meaning of these protesters being butchered, kind of, right, like cattle. And it creates this sort of third undepicted meaning. And that's what Eisenstein's really interested in, is how you create an undepictable, essentially, an undepictable meaning in cinema. And Tarkovsky's not really interested in doing that because he's not interested in you taking one meaning away from his film. That's not the point of a Tarkovsky film, is to walk out being like, oh yeah, I got that. That was easy. Like I said, you walk out feeling dumber, and that's the point.
Yeah.
And if you felt dumb watching it, then good, you were supposed to. If you felt like you got everything, then you're the idiot. I don't know how to tell you. Like, it's not an easy film. It's not supposed to be an easy film. It's not really supposed to be like mass media in the way that Eisenstein was trying to be. Even though he ends up being, right, like one of the most famous directors of all time for doing that, among many other things.
Right.
So this is the kind of debate and chronological break between Eisenstein and Tarkovsky. Even though they're making films like very far apart, I can promise you for a very long time after Eisenstein that his method still kind of reigns supreme, and it still does. We still use these methods in film, advertising, everything.
Which makes sense because Tarkovsky, in his own book, he differentiates the art which he is trying to make, or his idea of art, from a consumable, and he kind of puts the idea of what he doesn't name Eisenstein, but he kind of points to that, like that very nature of that being consumable by mass people as the very thing which makes it kind of not art in a way. So Tarkovsky is inherently trying to make difficult stuff that people on the whole are not going to like.
Like it is art in its own way, and it also is art because when Eisenstein's doing it, he's really like the first to do it. And so it's interesting in that way, but right, we're like 50 years on from that. And so Tarkovsky's like, we have to do something different. And right, he's working in the Soviet Union, so it's honestly unbelievable that a lot of these films are made, and that's like kind of a separate conversation, but just the fact that he is working in sort of such a restrictive system. I wouldn't agree that it's as restrictive as people make it out to be, but it is restrictive nonetheless. And he makes these films that so don't fit within that system is fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is after he leaves the Soviet Union, his films don't really do that well. I would disagree with him in that his later films, his last two that he makes outside of the Soviet Union, are not his best ones. And I think that is the general consensus, I believe, to be the case, which is just an even like more interesting kind of tidbit. But I digress.
No, it's interesting. I think it's also kind of funny that he opens his book on several letters he gets from people, mostly angry ones. The idea of Tarkovsky, like they'll identify themselves as like, yeah, I'm a steel worker out here in, Krasnoyarsk or something. And the idea of Tarkovsky sitting down and like reading a steel worker's letter about how he hated his movie and being so mad that he decided to put it in a book is just so funny.
I know, it's just something you wouldn't see today.
No.
I don't know. It's endlessly entertaining.
It is.
And, I say read the book, but it probably won't help anyways because he's really vague in most of the book, but it's still worth reading.
It won't help you necessarily understand Solaris better, but it will help you understand kind of what he's trying to do better. So when you walk away and you feel dumber, you're like, all right, well, let's have a dialogue.
I guess that was the point.
Right. But speaking of feeling dumber, let's talk about the film itself. You've got a lot of stuff to talk about. I find this is really fascinating. Do you want to start anywhere?
Oh, I don't know about that.
You got a lot more to talk about than most people who watch this film have to say about the film. Having me qualify it that way. Is there anywhere in particular you want to start?
I feel like I have to start with my acknowledgement on my knowledge, which is partially my own, and the professor that I took the Tarkovsky course, Ilya Kutik, who was a personal friend of Andrei and knew him pretty well and kind of grew up sort of alongside this family. I learned a lot from him in this course. So, if you do happen to be at Northwestern and have the opportunity to take the course, you should. But so a lot of the random factoids that I have, some of them come from this class. A lot of them were my own kind of interest stuff that I found, but so some of the stuff on like the mysticism of it, I'm not sure I would have stumbled on my own here. But the mysticism is one of the most important parts, I think. And I could just jump into mysticism if you want.
Let's jump right into it.
Now, sci-fi as a whole, I know we said sci-fi sucks, but
I didn't say that. I like sci-fi.
I heard you say sci-fi sucks. I heard it. Usually, I would say it involves going a place or something coming to a place, and Tarkovsky says no. We're going into humanity basically, and so Solaris, I think the name comes from the Latin solus, this sort of sun-like planet, and in medieval mysticism, the sun is this representation of the human soul. And so Solaris is not really that much of an expedition into some place or some, sci-fi, some realistic sci-fi exploration story. No, it's about the people that are in the story. And that's what's kind of like makes it almost like the anti-sci-fi in some way. And so as we explore Solaris, the planet, and as we see Chris and Hari interact, we're kind of asked to explore what constitutes this idea of soul, right? What makes us us? What makes us human? And, what separates us from everything else? And so that is kind of what that exploration is in the film. And that's why when you go in expecting 2001: A Space Odyssey, you're going to think, wow, this is a really long shot of me sitting in a Japanese taxi.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to build on that. And I do not think this is the mindset here, but that early scene I mentioned of Burton showing this committee this tape of what he saw when he was flying around the Sea of Solaris, it almost feels like a sort of rebuttal to like sci-fi or 2001 or your expectations where we've got these fantastical things happening as a result of Solaris, but those things are not capturable by technology. A camera is put on them, and you've got, and this is a fascinating scene because it's dead silent. Not a cough, not a shoe scrape, not a bit of music, just silent footage of a sea. And there is no ability for the community to tell that what Burton has gone through is real at all. And when we get to the station too, Chris is entirely blindsided by these guests that are on the station because these two, originally three scientists who've been there, are entirely unable to account for them and have not been reporting those things. These phenomena, which in many other sci-fi films, being sci-fi films, are interested in engaging with them scientifically or, with the appearance of scientific, appeal, is entirely absent of this film. This phenomenon can only be experienced personally and is only experienced personally. You put a camera on it and it literally doesn't even appear.
Yeah, Tarkovsky probably wouldn't have been a big STEM guy, I don't think.
Well, he does. I think he draws an interesting comparison to what he sees as the purpose of science trying to reveal the world, around us. And he kind of says, well, art's kind of like that, but opposite. He says that over the course of many pages, and I don't think that entirely stands up to his full argumentation, but the book's there if you want to read it.
I think that it is a really good opening because it's sort of, playfully poking fun at Soviet bureaucracy and the Soviet system, but it's what I say to my students too, is it's making fun of us just as much as it's making fun of them. It's making fun of any sort of a culture that takes empirical analysis so seriously, to the point that there can't be anything unexplained by, our idea of science. And I would say we do this, I mean, just as bad. And it's just pretty funny.
It's funny. It's a good bit.
That's all I got to say on that.
Right, which is where we start, notably, is where we start with Chris Kelvin, is that where Burton shows him this film and says, hey, you have to believe me, there are things out there that we do not understand. And Chris pretty much blows him off and says, look, all right, all I saw was just ocean, and that's all it is. He is the rational scientist. He's the psychologist. He deals entirely with the rational, which is what will quickly become unraveled and almost immediately go to the wayside as he goes to the station. Mm-hmm. I mean, before he even goes, he like burns his research notes, which he's unable to accept things that, which I think, as I understand it, he was researching Solaris and maybe was even engaging with some of those less rational things. But when he's going to the station at this point, he is, because of all this other knowledge, which clearly is there, because it cannot square with his, as you say, understanding, his empirical understanding of reality as well. Okay, I guess we have to burn it.
Yes. Now, you'll probably note the how busty the film is, the pure amount of busts that appear
Sure.
in houses, libraries, places like this. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the film is kind of already giving you some insight into what's about to happen. A lot of the busts that I was able to see were busts of Plato, I believe. Now, I am not a 100% expert, but the sort of main takeaway that would be applicable to the film, the idea that, things can't necessarily be destroyed because images and ideas, they sort of are pre-existing and therefore can't be destroyed, compared to Aristotle, who believes, yes, they can, right? So if you had a hard drive with the Slavic Literature podcast on it and you destroyed it, well, according to Aristotle, it ceases to exist. But like I believe, according to Plato, the idea of the Slavic Literature podcast is sort of, independent of its materiality, right? It's sort of, it's pre-existing the Slavic Literature podcast as such. Right. And so this is sort of what's kind of being played with in the film, right? Things can be destroyed, but can they really? And when you come to a culture that is so materialist, like the Soviets were, it's people can't accept it. There's this sort of dissonance that arises when anything can't literally be explained. So think about that.
So think about that. There's another. Let me know if you want to go slightly off this point, but there's something you mentioned to me when we were talking about this before we started, is the way that Tarkovsky has integrated other visual arts, especially paintings, into this film, into some really pivotal moments too. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
That is a great question, Cameron. Thank you very much for that. So there are some really good shots here, and the whole thing is kind of like reconstructed on sort of these eternal visual motifs, which is super interesting. And why he does it is because he's trying to engage with these questions, which are eternal and have been around basically forever. And yeah, my students didn't quite get this. They were kind of like, why does he care so much about visual art? And I said, I can't help you. I'm sorry. I have to go. I don't get paid enough. I didn't say that.
Right.
So there's a few recreations of famous paintings that take place in the film. The first one, or I guess the last one chronologically in the film, you've already noticed, is the Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, when Chris is hugging his father on the Solaris Island at the end, and it is sort of, shot for, well, not shot for shot, it is the shot of, this painting. There is the repeated image, I see it twice, the Lamentation over the Dead Christ by Andrei Tarkovsky. It's repeated at least twice in the film.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I can post these on Twitter this time because I already have them done for a PowerPoint that I made, so I can show them if people, want to see that good stuff. And then, of course, this this one of the teacup on the table in the rain next to the apple. That is not a specific visual piece, but a biblical theme that it comes in from Matthew 26. My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Kind of sort of relating to Christ's suffering. A lot of these are taken from the Bible, and then you have Rublov's Trinity, which makes an appearance. I don't believe it makes an appearance like in a visual recreation, but it is literally in the film. Chris is leaning against the ledge that has an icon of the Trinity there, which that's a whole just separate can of worms. Yeah, I looked like the "It's Always Sunny" gif. I'm Charlie in the mailroom trying to explain that one to my students whenever that comes up.
Right. That's fair. I mean, especially that ending, that painting, that Return of the Prodigal Son. If you're familiar with the story of the Prodigal Son, I think what that means goes without saying that comparison to that note. But if you're not familiar, what happens is that the Prodigal Son is that this guy, this landowner, has he's got two sons, and one son says, "Hey, Father, I know you've got an inheritance for me. Could I have it now?" The father says, "Sure." And that son goes off and he spends some number of months to years using that money up on gambling and drinking and living a great life. And then one day, but eventually he runs out of money, but he doesn't know what to do. And one day the father's walking along and he sees this guy on the ground. He's goes over to help him, and he realizes that this, emaciated, dirty man is his son. And he brings it back home and he orders, a feast to be had. And he says, "Look, my son was gone and now he's back." And the other brother is like, "Hey, wait, hold on. Wait, so he took his inheritance and he spent it all, frivolously, and then you find him and then you're going to welcome him back with a party? What? That's not right." And his father says, "Look, be that as it may, this is my son. He was dead to us and now he's back, and that is cause for celebration." And then they can continue on with that. And I think that's interesting because it is in its own way almost like an argument against this rational response of, you get this brother. You might understand the brother's point of hey, this guy did not make the right decisions. Why are we still, accepting and pulling him back in as readily? The story message of that story was, it's not about these rational decisions. It is about finding joy in the individuals and people in our lives in a way. And then that's one way you could take the story. That's how I take the story. And that's how, that shot, drawing that explicit comparison, really seems to hammer some of these themes home for me, at least.
Well, it's also sort of a instruction in that true sort of honest return to God, he will always welcome you back.
Sure, yeah.
And a lot of this film, especially with the Trinity kind of making this appearance, has to do with kind of trying to reestablish this sort of harmony between people, I think. And that's missing. The people that... Or at least in the case of the protagonist, the fact that Hadi comes back, there was an imbalance in that relationship that has not been reconciled. You look at Gibrian, he kills himself not just because he's haunted by the reoccurrence of the guests, but because he thinks that he's the only one seeing them, and he bears that burden alone. And so he breaks the sort of the trinity of people who are on that ship with him. And so that's why, to me, these biblical themes are so important for Tarkovsky. It's not we don't need to know more about Solaris. We need to know more about ourselves first. And that's really what's making people unhappy. It's not that there are weird sci-fi things happening.
Right.
It's that we're just already unhappy. And we already have some sort of really serious imbalance in our lives. And that's why it continues to be a good film, right? You don't watch now and discredit it because it's not accurate sci-fi or realistic sci-fi. I quite frankly, the sci-fi stuff is ridiculous. I mean, Chris is doing a rocket ship blast off wearing a yellow mesh shirt. Why? How would that be good?
No, this is a better vision of the future than we have. I think if we sent more,
I think it is.
I think if we sent more astronauts into space, just wet mesh shirt, leather jacket, we'd be in a better vision of the future.
Right. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But no, that's why the film continues to be watched today, and why people think that it's one of the greatest films of all time. And again, I don't want to get into every single specific recreation of visual art because there's
so much.
There's so much of it. Like the whole film is structured on these visual components, and that's like kind of to me also inherently refutes the sort of empiricist basis of the society in which the film takes place. Right? It kind of, not everything is based on linear progress. The progress in the film is sort of a circularity, if you will. The action keeps coming back to, right, these pieces of visual art, these paintings, these biblical themes that they've already happened, and they've been happening even before they were painted and made. You know what I mean? And so it's like engaging with that in such a deep and interesting and kind of provocative level, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Tarkovsky does write the script not alone, but in one of the really interesting moments of the film for me, they're all having kind of a wake for Gabarian. And interestingly, it happens in a library, which, as my understanding from, of course, this is based on Stanislav Lem's, book of the same name. This is not something that happens in that book. So much of this film does not happen in that book. Lem was not super happy with this script. But as they're kind of sitting there in this library, which is entirely naturalistic, very 1970s wood paneling, no sign of technology whatsoever, they propose a toast, and I think this is Snout, but Snout, I believe, says, "In this situation, mediocrity and genius are equally useless. We have no interests in conquering any cosmos. We want to extend the Earth to the borders of the cosmos. We don't know what to do with other worlds. We don't need other worlds. We need a mirror. We struggle for contact, but we'll never find it. We in the foolish human predicament of striving for a goal that he fears that he has no need for. Man needs man. Let's drink to Gabarian, to his memory, even though he got frightened." And this is all happening while Chris is paging through a copy of Don Quixote to like the minutia of what of all these small points and all these things. We could go on forever with them. There's so much significance in these small details.
Yeah. There is. I mean, the library scene in general is kind of the climax, I think. For me, it's the scene of Hari staring at the painting of the hunters in the snow.
Right.
And if you will indulge me.
Please.
And my German mysticism. Mysticism. So I believe that Tarkovsky was influenced or interested in this theologian, mystic, Master Eckhart. He was a German mystic, and he had this idea that hearing was the language of the soul. And if you notice in the film, there are a lot of ears. There are a lot of zooms ins on ears. And this, I believe, is why. Because this has to do with how we reach the soul. So when Hari is looking at the Hunters of the Snow painting in the library, she not only sees it, but she hears it. It's deliberately shot from her perspective. No disagreement on that. Or at least it switches to being shot in her perspective. And then sound starts to play as she's looking at the different details on the painting. And she even comments on, how when Chris starts to talk to her, she says, "Oh, sorry, I kind of, zoned out there for a second," or, whatever she says. I don't know exactly. But we know that we're sort of in her own trance, right? And so if hearing is this sort of language of the soul, if this is what sort of makes us human, then this can be read as the moment where Hari actually develops a soul. And so to me, this is the kind of climax of the film, right? She's done it. And that's super interesting.
That is interesting. It's kind of funny. I was actually going to talk about that same scene. That's funny. From a slightly different angle. This is taking this point from... This is from a piece called The Science Fiction Films of Andrei Tarkovsky. I'm sure I saw the title you would hate, by Simonetta Salvastroni. And this author takes that same scene, takes a slightly different approach, and they take a page from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's an Austrian philosopher. And from his, I believe this is the second book, Philosophical Investigations, he writes this idea of how adults can experience the world in changing ways, even though the world doesn't change around them. And he writes, "I contemplate a face and suddenly notice its likeness to another. I see that it has not changed, and yet I see it differently. I call this experience noticing an aspect." And this author ties that, the same scene of looking at this painting and taking it not for itself, but for, something. And this author ties it in connection to Hari, or us as of your kind of watching this vision of childhood that we see of Chris earlier, where he's like with his father and sees this scene and is able to become human in different sense from what you're talking about, but become human by making these novel connections instead of just existing as this creature moving on. So your point is interesting too, but I think regardless of how we get there, I agree with the basic point that this is the moment that Hari is becoming her own human character. And she does assert that, I believe, immediately afterwards. Sartorius, who is never kind and is always trying to assert these aren't real, she says, like, Yachilabek, I'm a human. You're very cruel, in the moments after when he continues to assert that. And I think you're right that this is the climax of the film. And however we get there, this is the moment where she becomes...
Well, as long as we can all agree that I'm right. I think,
right.
I think we've established I'm right. That's all I hear.
I think we've established that's the
Sorry,
that's the important
talking?
part.
All I heard was that I'm right.
So then she kind of takes off, and after that is when she attempts suicide. This Hari history repeating itself before she changes. She makes her own decision and changes the path of everyone else. And to a certain degree, I guess that depends on how you read the ending and how Chris maybe doesn't actually. His fate is not really changed, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know that's. I find his ending less interesting than her ending personally.
Yeah.
I think that with her ending, there can be no doubt that she does become human.
Yes, yeah.
In that she sacrifices herself out of love for everybody aboard, especially Chris. And this is a completely irrational thing to do. And I think, I don't really know that much about other species, but it seems to me that is only a human thing to do. I think that's kind of the point, right? Like other species don't do that. Mm-hmm. They have some sort of self-preservation instinct, right? We will willingly throw aside our own self-preservation instinct on a sort of irrational basis that can't be explained. And so the conclusion of the film rests on something that cannot logically be explained, which is again kind of the point.
Right.
And that's how kind of how I read it, which is why it's kind of provocative in that way.
I know. Yeah, I agree. By becoming human, she takes the stance that animals often don't do, but humans do. Well, I guess animals will do this, but like choosing to sacrifice herself, which all the human characters are in a total state of listlessness. They aren't choosing to engage with each other at all. She's the only one who shows concern for the others, really.
No, she's the most human.
Yeah, in a way.
I mean, the rest of them are saying, forget her. She's not human. She's a neutrino reaction. Let's just take blood samples. I'm just going to perform surgery because whatever, she'll heal.
Yeah.
Who cares if she feels pain? It's humane. She'll heal.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you could argue that's more human than what she does.
Yeah, and I think it's very funny that, too, at the very end, I believe this is after she sacrifices herself, Snout and Chris are kind of chatting, and Snout just kind of throws off on the offhand that the happiest people are the ones who are not interested in these cursed questions that we're talking about. When a man is happy, the meaning of life and other eternal themes rarely interest him. Mm-hmm. So, and these characters who are all deeply unhappy have spent this entire time trying to wonder what this means for them.
I think that's kind of true, I mean, personally, but it also, it does feel kind of Tolstoyan in that way. I don't know who,
he specifically invokes Tolstoy in that, which is very funny. He does. Well, which, of course, but for the benefit of the audience. But anyway, sorry, continue.
I don't know if that's, what he's working with, but, when Tolstoy kind of concludes, and he's like, I don't know, just be happy doing chores. That kind of feels like what the film is sort of getting at.
Yeah.
And it's really, you can ask all the questions you want, but maybe start by those around you,
Right.
Or dare I say yourself.
Indeed.
Indeed, I may say.
Yeah, I think that's I forget, there's another paper I read. I'm not going to go too much into it. But this is the fascinating title, Back to the House 2 on the chronotopic and ideological reinterpretation of Lem, Solaris, and Tarkovsky's film by Rumiana Delcheva and Edward Vlasov. I don't know if you necessarily... I don't know if I found the whole thing that interesting, but I think it is an interesting point that they make, which is that unlike Lem's book, which is a pretty linear, straightforward, you go from Earth to Solaris, and that's from Earth to the stars. In in a way, even though it's not true, but the perception of what happens in Tarkovsky's Solaris is from Earth to the stars, back to Earth again, although, of course, this is its own sort of Earth, in that we return again to the Earth that bore us, because as these characters assert, we're not really looking for things out in the universe. We're looking for ourselves, and we are eternally replicating ourselves, and even though we're out here in the space, we're still bringing Don Quixote and busts of Plato and all these things, because it's all about us in the end. The search for new knowledge is very anthropocentric, and if this knowledge, as we've talked about, doesn't jive with our anthropocentric understanding of things, then we discard it.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's all I really wanted. Well, actually, there's so much more to talk about, but there's a lot of also like Borderlands and things that I'm interested in, but I don't really understand, so I don't want to talk too much about them. But are there any like?
There's a lot.
Yeah.
More to go into on this, but for me this was like the most interesting couple of things that I could talk about in an hour, but I could talk for like 20 hours on this movie.
Well, okay, we're coming up to the end of our hour, so how about I get you this, how about a couple things that when people watch this film, if they have not yet watched it, or if they want to go back for a rewatch, you cannot fully or don't, you can either not fully explain or don't fully have the time to explain, but think they should pay attention to? Are there any elements that you'd want to point to?
Oh, I think one that we talked about before we started recording was color.
Yes. Yeah.
Not even gonna dip my toe into that one at the moment. Just, pay attention to it.
Right. Actually, I want to dip it very briefly. I think it's very funny. We had the same moment that there's a lot of blue early in the film, and we were both racking our minds. And we watched this at different times, but apparently we both had the very same thought at some point in the film of, what does blue mean? Oh, wait, is he just trying to show that it's night? And I'm still, we never figured out where we came from that, but I think it's funny we had the same thought on that moment. Yeah. But anyway, yes.
Nature.
Mm-hmm.
Nature generally. Horses. Tarkovsky loved horses, so, that's there. In our relationship to nature is extremely important. And if you understand that, then you understand why he put the Japanese highway in the middle of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
For 5 minutes. That's 5 minutes of much.
Come talk about it with us in our Discord. I'm not going to go into it all here. Maybe we'll have to do a second episode. Who knows?
Right. We might have to.
We just might have to. And the last one, I would say sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's so sparse that normally sci-fi you associate with, advanced technology that has just a lot of sound, right?
Right.
Of course, we're used to soundtracks and scores and whatnot, and in addition to that, just the beep boop bop boop of sci-fi, right? Like, space and stuff blasting off, and there's really not a lot of it in the film at all. Most of it's just this eerie quiet.
Yeah.
So think about it.
Think about it.
That's what Tarkovsky said. He said, "Think about it."
He said, "Think about it." Yeah, all good notes. I think the only thing I would add in addition to that, I'm stealing this vague idea from your notes, but the idea of memory. Which is specifically in relation to one scene towards the end of the film, which, again, pointing back to color, is entirely yellow. I think we mentioned it before, but where Chris has this interaction with another Hari from his own memory, who is an entirely different actress, and it's remarked upon that she's like, I can't really remember your face, and they have this conversation, which is, as you note in your notes, explored much more in the movie Mirror. But of course,
I can't wait to cover that one. That one's probably my favorite production history.
Yeah. Oh, from the little I've heard, it
was just a cluster all the way through.
Might be a whole episode just on, hey, here's what happened behind the scenes in Mirror.
Yeah. Good times.
Good times. Well, all right, Matt, before we completely wrap up, and I know there's so much more we could say about this, but look, we got to end it somewhere. So next week, we're bringing back an author, sort of from the archives. We're going to be reading Yachina Guzel once again, not, in fact, going back to Zuleika, but to her new book, or relatively new book anyway, Volga Tales. We're going to be covering parts 1 and 2 of Volga Tale, which has been a very interesting read so far, so I'm really interested and very excited to talk about it. And to help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to notes containing all the research that went into this episode, head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. And before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters: Eric, Ben, Jeff, Mai, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Anne, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Irini, and Pack Rob. The music used in this episode was Staré Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify, and the links and spelling are in the show notes.
You'll hear from us again soon, unless we don't come back from space.